Today we'd like to welcome you to your masterclass on sexual ethics in the tradition of Judaism. We are filming today from the Emanuel Synagogue in Woollahra, and it is my pleasure to welcome to you today our presenter, Rabbi Kaiserblueth, and it is really a pleasure to have you presenting to our HSC students today on sexual ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, and it's a pleasure for me to be here as well. First of all, I depend on many of you to help me reach a wider audience, to inform them and to educate them on different aspects of different cultures which you are immersing yourself in now. And it's important, the topic that we're covering today, sexual ethics, because in many forms of society and corners, it is shunned, looked down on, ignored, but it actually forms a very important, fundamental, I would say, part of human interactions and human relationships. There are a few background texts that I want you to be aware of before we delve into the individual ideas and concepts, and we'll start, first of all, with, at the beginning, the story of creation. And it's important to understand what the act of creation actually was. It wasn't necessarily forming things, but it was actually separating things, right? Setting boundaries between things. What's the first thing that God created? And according to the story, light. But what was it? It was separating light from darkness. And then it was separating the heavens from the waters. And then the waters from the dry land. And then the light, the bodies in the sky, the sun, the moon, separating those. And then separating the animals. And then separating human beings. And so, in many ways, creation is separating. And separating things is really the fundamental basis of what being holy means. Separating something, setting it aside to be special, for a unique purpose. There's also, we have very important, if you read the Bible, dare I say, it's actually filled with stories of physical intimacy, consensual or otherwise sometimes. But it is there, prevalent all throughout the text. Where else do we have that? In the story in the writings in Leviticus, Vayikra, the third book of the Bible. We have two different chapters where it tells us the sexual prohibitions of who we can and who we cannot be with, separating those kinds of relationships. We also have many different stories throughout the Bible, but one of the more important ones is the book of Song of Songs, Shira Shirim in Hebrew. Many people question, why is that story, why is that book included in the canon of the Jewish Bible? What is that book about? Well, to be blunt, it is erotic literature, and it can be quite graphic. So the question is, what is that doing there? I understand you have the books of the Bible with Moses in Egypt and Israelites and Mount Sinai and wandering in the desert and the prophets and kings and all those things. Yeah, that makes sense. I gotcha. I'm with you. Why a book of erotic literature? And I think, again, the message is physical intimacy is a very important, fundamental part of who we are as human beings. Now, later on, there's an allegorical meaning given to it that it's actually a description or an extended metaphor for the relationship between God and the Jewish people. I can read it that way, but there's also a dictum that we have in Jewish understanding and in interpretation is that you can't go away too far from the original or the simple meaning. And I think the simple meaning is thus. Sexual relationships and sexual intimacy is important, and we shouldn't shun it. We should talk about it. We should celebrate it in the right context. One more example of a very important story. It's from the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish writings, rabbi writings, earliest, let's call it around the 2nd to the 5th century after the Common Era. And it said there's a rabbi, his name is Rav Kahana, and he's told that he has to learn everything he can from his teacher, Rav. That's his name. So much so that he follows him wherever he goes. He immerses himself in his teaching, sits at his feet as he's reciting laws. He follows him when he eats. He's really trying to absorb everything he possibly can, to the point that he goes underneath the bed of his teacher, Rav. So this guy, Kahana, is underneath the bed of his teacher, Rav, while Rav and his wife are engaging in sexual relationships. Rav, the teacher, says, understandably, like most of us would, in essence, what the heck are you doing down there? He's angry. And Kahana, the student, says, no, this also is Torah, and I need to learn it. Now, it's interesting. You have to understand from the Jewish perspective, they include things in our texts because they want us to learn something from it. And so what is it that we're supposed to learn from here? That's even this, the engaging of sexual intercourse by a married couple is Torah, is part of Jewish life. It's part of what we do, right? Living a Jewish life, guided by our ethics and principles, is not only something that I do when I'm here in the synagogue. It's not only something that I do when I'm praying. It's not only something that I do in discrete moments of my life that I can compartmentalize. I am what I am always, in every single aspect of my life, including in the bedroom. So what then do we need to understand, and how do we understand what this is supposed to look like? Well, there's also, going back a little bit to the story of creation, it tells us the purpose of how one is supposed to be. That it says, Lo tov yihiyeh levad. It is not good for someone to be alone. When it's talking about Adam before Eve is created. It's not good for someone to be alone. Well, what else does it say? That they should cleave together, as eres kenegdo, to cleave together as one. And so this is the basis that we understand of a relationship. That it's not good for someone to be alone. And so we cleave to one another. Interestingly, in that sense, and by the way, there is absolutely a sexual undertone there of what that means to cleave to one another, it doesn't say anything about procreation. It doesn't say that the purpose is to continue the line. What is the purpose? Well, in some cultures, it is simply and uniquely for procreation. But for human beings, it's an act of expression of our relationship towards one another. But in what setting then? Well, you have to understand the way that human relationships have evolved in the legal sense, if you will, of a marriage to one another. The idea and conception of marriage has changed over time. And we're not going to discuss today the actual rituals of getting married. That is not the topic today, but more today is the expression of that relationship. One of the things that we learn, and the rabbis in the writings that they have, again, going back to the Talmud, it talks about the different requirements of sexual relationships in a married couple. One of them is, depending on your profession, will determine how many times and how often, the frequency, you have to perform that. Now, who is responsible? Actually, the Talmud says that the man has the requirement to satisfy his wife, not the other way around. And so depending on your profession will determine how often that needs to happen. So for example, if you're a merchant traveling in convoy, it's about once a week. If you're a mariner, a merchant, it's about once a month because you assume you're going to be gone more often. And what is it then that you're allowed to do? Well, the Talmud, the rabbis teach us that so long as both are in a consenting relationship, it's up to them, whatever it is that they want to do in the privacy of their own home. The privacy of their own bedroom. Whatever it is that they are comfortable doing. So the rabbis actually continue and say as well, what does that mean? And they list several things, such as normal sexual intercourse, if there is such a thing, oral sex, and other activities, shall we say, that the rabbis, and they use loads of different euphemisms in the Talmud writings, such as you can put the paintbrush into the jar of paint, or and other such things. It is interesting, even 2,000 years ago, there were people who were, shall I say, a bit squeamish or embarrassed to write some of these things in plain language. Some things just don't change, right? And so that is part of the evolution of this, but there was already an understanding over 2,000 years ago of the importance of this. And when we write our marriage contracts, for example, which is the ketubah, which you would have studied in the marriage class, it specifies, again, the obligations and the responsibilities that the man has towards the woman, not the other way around. Interestingly, that the relationship is based on, we're talking thousands of years ago, on procreation. Now that is marriage, not the purpose of sex. I want to be clear. But in a marriage, the failure to produce children years and years and years ago theoretically could be grounds for divorce. But that is a purpose, again, I want you to separate between marriage and the purpose of sex. Intercourse, physical intimacy. But the purpose of sex in itself is seen not necessarily as for procreation. Now, there are elements that we need to discuss within that relationship. So first of all, does Judaism believe in premarital sex? I can give you two answers to that. One, not really, because sex was one of the ways in which you got married. There are three ways in our tradition that people get married. One is through the contract, the ketubah, signed by witnesses. Another is through the exchange of an object of value with a legal declaration, such as today, usually a ring. The third way was with sex, intercourse, with the purpose of getting married. Now, the rabbis decided in their wisdom a very long time ago, about 1,000 or so years ago, that we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to take all three of these rituals, put them together into one ceremony, and that is now how we get married, right? You have the signing of in a Jewish wedding today, you would have the signing of the contract right before the ceremony. In the ceremony, you have the exchange of the ring with the legal declaration, and then immediately after that, the couple then goes off and has what we say in Hebrew, yichud, which is alone time, where theoretically they are consummating the marriage. Generations ago, what would have happened is they would have had the ceremony, the couple would go and then spend the night alone. There would be witnesses outside the door to make sure that nobody went in or out, and there were no other exits, and they would station themselves outside the room, and they would then be there in the morning to check that they both came out, they were still there, the assumption then being that they consummated the marriage. Now, in a relationship as well, we see that there is a push towards procreation in that we have what's called the laws of family purity. Now, it's not anything to do with genetics or anything like that. It has to do with maintaining a sense of ritual purity in our lives. How does that happen? The idea is we want to elevate ourselves. In fact, one of the words for marriage in Hebrew is kiddushin, which is taken from the root kadosh, which is holy, right? If that's the case, what does that mean then? Well, remember I said the idea of creation is about attaining a sense of holiness in the world by separating certain things. God made the seventh day holy. Doesn't mean that the seventh day, Shabbat, is better than any other day. It's just this day has been set aside for a special purpose. You're a farmer 3,000 years ago and you want to offer something to God to give thanks. You have two different animals. I'm going to select this one. It's not better than that one. It's just this one I have now selected for that purpose of being an offering. It is now holy. It's not better than this one. It's separated for a special purpose. Similarly, when I get married, my wife is now separated from everybody else. I have a relationship with her that I have with nobody else. She's not better than anybody else. Well, she is to me, but she is fundamentally no different than any other woman or any other person. However, she is in the purposes of the relationship that I have with her that I have with no one else. She is made holy to me. She is consecrated to me. Indeed, that is the wording that we use when I give her the ring. Here is this ring through which I consecrate you to me according to the laws of Moses and Israel. That act is elevating her in my eyes. Same thing, Shabbat is elevated, it's separated. It's fundamentally not any different from Saturday to Tuesday. It's the same 24-hour period, but Shabbat is now holy and made unique because of the specialness and uniqueness of its day, but it's not better. And so we understand then that there are certain times that we are to elevate ourselves. Shabbat, festivals, and such things, but also in a sexual sense. There are times that we are permitted and times we are not permitted to engage in sexual relations. This is the basis of what we call Taharat HaMishpacha, the laws of family purity. And in essence, it is in the times that a woman is menstruating, that is a time to refrain from sexual relations because that is a moment where a woman is impure. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. It has nothing to do with physical cleanliness or anything like that. The idea probably originates from this concept, this idea that you are mourning the loss, not of life, but the potential for life. Each and every time a woman menstruates, that means the egg that was released was not fertilized. That means a life was not created. So it's not a full mourning, but it is that loss of potential for life that was not created. And in that brief period of roughly 7 days, that is, and depending on how long the menstruation lasts, is the moment or that time where you are not permitted to engage in sexual relations. There's some streams of Judaism would say they're not even allowed to touch. We'll put a pin in that. We'll come right back to that. Just to finish this concept, it is not that the woman is dirty. It is not that the woman is in any way physically untouchable. It is simply this concept, this idea of mourning the loss of potential for life. Similarly, when a man has an ejaculation at night, or not necessarily at night, but outside of the purposes of sex, such as a nocturnal emission or something like that, also is considered ritually impure. Now, how do we remove this ritual impurity from our lives? One of the ways is to immerse ourselves in the mikvah, the ritual immersion of water. And it has to be what's called mayim chaim, living waters. It's not just my bathtub or a shower or something like that. It has to be water that is naturally flowing. Ideally, something like the ocean or a river. We can construct pools that are a bit more secluded for modesty purposes, but it's not just filling the tap with, it has to be water that's collected from rain, living waters. And so the idea is on the conclusion of the woman's menstrual cycle or after a man has had a nocturnal emission, that they would then go into the mikvah, this ritual bath, and they would immerse themselves and emerge pure, and then you would have the resumption of the relationship between the partners. Now, the added benefit to this is typically after the conclusion of the menstruation cycle, you have to wait, depending on which stream you are, several days, that you have about 2.5 to 3 weeks max of time that the couple can be together. And it culminates right in the middle of that time, which is, oh, by the way, when the woman in her cycle is most fertile. And so there is sort of, how did one of my teachers put it, reverse birth control. That you are doing it in a way that encourages children to be born. And so, again, I want to be clear, it's not necessarily the purpose of, but it's a handy thing that you are trying to procreate and have more kids, and you do it in a way that allows for the greatest chance of success for children to be born. this is, again, an idea of separation within the boundaries of when it is and is not permissible. Separating is a big thing that us Jews believe in, separating things from the time that it is appropriate from a time that it is not. Right? We separate our week from the mundane of the week to the holiness of Shabbat. We also separate people we're supposed to be with and people we're not. And even in the context of people I'm supposed to be with, there are times when I can be with them and times when I should not. We refrain, we control our urges. But, again, in the context of this topic, it's very clear from our tradition and our text, sex is a good thing. Physical intimacy is a good thing. Have lots of it. Enjoy it. Make the most of it in the right context. And what is that context? Again, is it only in marriage? It is not. Most traditional sources will say that, yes, it is in a committed married relationship. Now, that comes from a time when people were getting married in, say, a lot younger than they are today. People were probably maturing a lot younger than they were today. So in the realm of somewhere between 16 and 18 years old, that is when people would start to get married off. People were probably living a little bit less responsibilities or requirements, I should say, of education, more of a requirement of younger people and more labor-intensive work such as agriculture. You needed lots of kids. You needed lots of labor to work a farm. You don't necessarily need that today. And so today, the average age of marriage is in the realm of 29 to 30 years old. And this is where you're going to start to see a distinction between the streams of Judaism. Now, these rules of family purity, Taharat HaMishpacha, they are really practiced quite strictly in many ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox families, mostly. In the Masorti, the conservative stream where I belong, to lesser extent, and in the Reform movement, barely at all. Which is not to say they don't use the mikvah, we do, but we use that for many other purposes. Strictly speaking, for the rules of family purity and the laws of menstruation, and in that sense, it is not really practiced the further away you move from orthodoxy. There's other concepts, such as modesty, which in Hebrew we say it's tzniut. The idea is you have, and this is where there's less of a religious textual basis for this and much more of a cultural basis. By which I mean, you're going to struggle in the earlier texts of the Torah and the earlier rabbinic writings to find a justification for modes of dress, for example, and separating men and women. That is something that is much, 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 much later, relatively recently, I would say, which is not to say it doesn't have a grounding, but it's more of a cultural grounding depending on where the Jews were living at that time. And you will see the same thing, for example, in Islam and in Christianity. Depending on where they grew up and where they were, the movements, I mean, not people, that these rules of separating men and women will be vastly different. But it's not so much a religious textual basis, it's more a cultural basis. How does that reveal itself or come into practice today? Well, you have people who say that men and women should be separate to varying degrees. That women should cover their bodies. And that takes on various different levels, from simply having a hairband to covering their head completely to wearing a wig. And the idea there is that the hair is something that is seen as something very beautiful, is reserved for your husband, for your partner. Also about revealing clothing. Shoulders are covered, arms are covered, up to your neck, depending on that, and also how far down to the knee, below the knee, all the way down to the ankle. And the reasoning here is, from my understanding, the way that I would teach this is that as a man, it's very difficult to control yourself. Therefore, the woman needs to remove herself from that situation so he doesn't tempt the male. Here in this synagogue, we don't practice, for example, separating men and women. They're allowed to sit next to each other. We don't make any explicit requirements of dress, except for we tell people to dress modestly in a place of worship or in a ritual service, such as a wedding or a funeral or things of that nature. But there are stricter rules, depending on which synagogue you go to, that would require, for example, women to be covered, men to have a head covering, men and women to be separated in the service. Now, part of that also is that women are not, in Orthodox settings, are not required, or excuse me, I should say obligated for some of the rituals, and therefore they don't count in the quorum of people that are needed to do things, and therefore they sit in a separate space. We don't practice that in the Masorti and the progressive reform movements, that men and women have the same opportunities and obligations as men. That's how it is. And you will see various different sizes of the separation between men and women. Some is a very low symbolic separation, a row of planters of plants or something like that, to a very flimsy, very sheer curtain, to a wall going all the way up, to some extremes where they're in a separate room in the back with a tiny little window so they can hear what's going on. Some synagogues will have women upstairs and men downstairs. You'll have different ways that is expressed. Part of that, again, is this idea, this cultural idea that men and women needed to be separate. There is some basis for that, but it's a stretch that men and women would have been separated one day of the year in the worship of the temple service when it came to one of our most important festivals of Sukkot, that there was this festival called Simcha Beit Shoeva, which was the water ceremony. That apparently, according to some sources, it was a crazy party that went sometimes a little overboard, and you would have to separate them so things wouldn't happen. The idea, though, is it's a very tenuous link there, but that, in essence, is where they many times is drawn as a source for these separations. There is also this idea that dancing together will lead to inappropriateness of some sorts. Again, in a time and a place where we live, you would ask me and Reform rabbis, that is a responsibility and obligation that is placed on both sides. It's not just women who have to remove themselves. Men have to also behave in a certain way. And it's based on a concept that we go back to the story of creation. Who are we, and where do we come from? That God has breathed the breath of life, and neshima, into all of us. Meaning that we are all, and then it continues, we are all created in the image of God. All of us, not just Jews, not just men. It's very clear. It says men and women. Therefore, we have this responsibility to ourselves because there's godliness in us, but also the one who I'm speaking to, the one who I'm interacting with. Because you, in a way, are a reflection of me, because you also have the divine spark in you. And therefore, in every single aspect of my life, in every single aspect of every interaction I have with you, must reflect that godliness in you, including the sexual aspects. So there is a very, very important aspect there that I need to understand and always treat the person with respect, myself and others. And so going back to that, so premarital sex, is that a thing? On the one hand, one could make the argument, no, not really, because if you had sex with someone, theoretically you might be married to them. That takes away a little bit of the agency, but it also needs to understand that there has to be an intention there. Nowadays, most people would not say premarital sex is okay, but you may have some rabbis who will understand the reality of the situation and say, I can't very well forbid people for doing things that they're doing already. But we would say, as long as you're doing that in a respectful manner, in a monogamous manner, respect for yourself and others, and staying safe, then we can understand how you would need to fulfill that very basic human urge, especially considering that people are getting married much later in life, around 30 years old now, about 14 or so years, 15 years past the hormonal sexual prime of teenagehood. We have to understand and live in a real world, the reality there. Again, to be clear, not saying we condone it, we understand it, and we're dealing with real people in real situations. We also need to understand the concept of contraception. How does that work? This goes back to the story of Onan, the son of Judah, Onanism, and it's very often misunderstood. The story goes something like this. Judah has 3 sons. The eldest is married off to a woman. Her name escapes me at the moment. Sorry, let me just find my notes. I apologize. I think it was Naomi, but give me 1 second. It was that he was married off. What was his name? Doesn't matter. He was married to, he had Onan, and Shelah. Okay? And the story goes that he was, Tamar was the name. Thank you. Tamar was the name. Is married to Tamar. It says that is evil. He's a bad guy. God kills him. Now they have to fulfill what's called the levirate marriage. So Onan is told he has to have a child with Tamar. The first one will be as his brother's child, so his line will continue. They're in the midst of intercourse, and Onan says to himself, I don't want to do this because why am I going to work so hard for an outcome that's not going to be mine? He pulls out, coitus interruptus, and it says he spills his seed. God gets angry and now kills Onan as well. Now, most people misunderstand this because they think that the sin here was that he spilled his seed. Likely is that the sin is he did not perform levirate marriage. And they use, and I would argue, misunderstanding and misapplying this lesson to say that masturbation is not allowed because you're wasting the seed. There still is a common thread throughout many different cultures and religions, Christianity and Judaism, that masturbation is awful, it's terrible, it's a sin, you shouldn't do it. Again, as with most things, I would say it's a little bit of a gray area because the sin there, I really think, was that he did not fulfill the obligations to his dead brother. Either way, there is a sense of you don't want to be consumed by that. But it also informs some of our understandings of contraception. And so in the most basic form, anything that is interrupting coitus, such as a barrier method, in the most traditional understandings would be either discouraged or not allowed. So, for example, a condom would theoretically not be acceptable in some forms of Judaism. But we also need to understand, again, we're living in a modern era where we have to take into account things such as STIs and safety and health. And so things like birth control pills, which are not a form of barrier method, would be acceptable. However, it doesn't do anything to prevent infections. And so we are also charged, by the way, in many of our rabbis, most famously Rambam Maimonides, his first commandment that we're supposed to fulfill, the first one in his code of law, is you must stay healthy. Because if you're not healthy, then you can't fulfill all the rest of the commandments. And so, one could argue, therefore, that in the competingness of these values, which, by the way, we have to do all the time, we always have to make choices between these values. More and more complicated life gets, because our tradition never could foresee all the potential outcomes in the future. I need to take into account how am I going to keep myself healthy by preventing infection. And therefore, I would say, not just for keeping yourself emotionally and mentally safe and healthy by not having unwanted children, also your health. So the barrier method, such as a condom, would not necessarily be forbidden. There is a very important understanding as well. Absolutely have children, not necessarily limiting how many you have, but you also have a responsibility to provide for them financially. You should not depend on outside streams of charity to keep yourself afloat, especially through choices that you have every amount of control over. The more and more children you have, the more and more you need to provide for them. Believe me, I have 3 kids. It's not cheap. I love them. There's a great comedian I once heard. My wife and I have however many 5 children, and the reason why we don't, because we don't want 6. It takes time. It takes resources. We do not live in the way that our ancestors did, in these close proximity where everybody contributes to. That's just not how society works anymore. The requirements to raise a child is challenging, which is not to say we don't want you to have children. We absolutely do, but we want you to have the amount that you can care for and raise in a loving, committed way. So contraception is seen now not just as a form of preventing childbirth, but also as a sense of keeping yourself safe and healthy, but also limiting that which you can provide for. Again, that's more of a understanding from a Masorti or progressive reform understanding. Orthodoxy likely would not endorse these kinds of ideas. But again, you have to understand it's not just a monolithic, but there's more of an understanding that that is a concept, not necessarily. Now, depending on health, prevent the wife from having children when she really should not be. Those are questions as well, because we're not allowed to put the wife or the mother at risk. Now, that's going to get more into your section when you talk about bioethics in terms of, say, abortion and things of that nature. So I'm not going to touch too much on that, except to say simply that the life of the the fetus, is seen as potential for life, and it's not life itself. And interrupting that process before it is conceived is not necessarily something that is seen as illegal or prohibited. It is discouraged, but there are certain circumstances that you need to take into account. Most importantly is, I am not a medical professional. You have questions about health, you have questions about safety, you have questions about these things. You should absolutely talk to your doctor. I can help inform, but I will not ever decide, especially things of a medical nature. We can help be guided by our principles, but understand that we are bound to choose life. That is one of the most important things that we have to do. I want to touch a little bit on the idea of same-sex relationships. Traditionally, if I can even use that, is that, or the simple answer is they're prohibited, they're not allowed. But that is, I would say, a misunderstanding or even a passé idea that is not really recognized so much anymore in the more liberal streams of Judaism, shall I say, Masorti and progressive reform. People ask me, will I condone or perform marriages? And I say, of a same-sex couple, my answer to that is simply, I will perform a marriage for any 2 Jews who love each other. The ceremony changes so slightly, but talking about the intimacy issues or the ideas there, we are told in those chapters of Leviticus, chapter 18 and 20, which I referenced earlier, about the prohibited relationships in the Bible. One of them says a man should not lie with a man as he does a woman, is an abomination. Yeah, it says that. There's lots of things that it says in the Bible as well that we don't necessarily follow. And for a whole host of historical reasons, the rules of sexuality have taken on a different mode and importance and sensitivity that other rituals have not. And every time I teach this, I remind people that whatever your opinion may or may not be, we are not talking about abstracts and we are not talking about theoreticals. We're talking about real people in real relationships experiencing real emotion. And we have to take that into account as well. And in a very long understanding and exploration, different movements have come to different understandings, but the Masorti and Reform movements have, through different processes, in essence, come to the same conclusion that, yes, we understand what the Bible says. Yes, we understand that that's what's there. No, we don't agree with that anymore, and we will either reinterpret that, which we have been doing for many years, or simply say there are some rabbis who say that's just wrong. We don't understand why, or we understood maybe in its time and in its place why it was there. It doesn't apply today. You have to understand the specific nature of the word abomination, to'eva, that is usually used in reference to acts that pagans would do, and understand the context. One understanding here is that the context of the book of Leviticus is written in juxtaposition to, hey, that's what pagans do, we're not going to do that. And not just, by the way, sexual ethics. The laws of what we eat is the same thing. You can't eat that because it's an abomination, a to'eva. That's what the pagans do in their ritual observances and cultic worship to their pagan gods. We don't do that, right? They do these orgies and whatever it is that they're going to do in their temple services. We don't do that. Well, if that indeed is the reasoning, we don't do that anymore. I'm not so concerned with that being a real consequence, that I may accidentally be worshiping to a pagan god of some sort. But quite the opposite is I am trying to honor the real love and emotion and connection and the creation of a family that couple has exhibited. And in many ways, that is the basis for our continued success for thousands of years. The basic unity in Judaism is not the individual, and it is not the family. It is not the community. It's the family. And everything we can do to strengthen that and to grow that family unit strengthens us as a people. Many people wonder why in the Ten Commandments, why does it have the prohibition of adultery? Why is that there? I can understand not worshiping idols, don't murder, don't steal. Those are big deals. And it's not to say that you should be condoning adultery, but why in the top 10? Why is that there? Why do we have an element involving a physical intimacy issue in the Ten Commandments? That to me is, it ostensibly would mean it doesn't make sense. Well, you understand what normally happens in a relationship where someone steps outside the bounds of who they're supposed to be with. They have an inappropriate relationship with someone they ought not to be doing it with. That usually spells the end of that initial relationship. And if the family is a basic unit, and therefore we do something that's going to destroy that, well, we've weakened ourselves as a people. We are trying to create and promote and strengthen those family units, those family relationships. Doing anything that undermines that by denying people who are creating a committed, respectful family unit is counterproductive. The way I see it, ours is a living, breathing, evolving tradition, based and rooted in texts and the wisdom of our ancestors, guided by that. And we use that not to stop that evolution and that process, but to continue it. And so the act or the decision to welcome in same-sex couples, for example, as normative human interactions was a natural process, a natural decision. And therefore, for where we sit here at Emanuel Synagogue and many of the more liberal streams of Judaism, or I would even say the more traditional, in that sense, it makes perfect sense. They are welcome just as everybody else, and is not seen as any distinction. If I could, I suppose, sum up, what is it that we are trying to convey here? Sex, first of all, is a very important element in the human condition. Judaism stresses and teaches that it's not so much a religion per se, but a way of life. Sex is an important part of that life in the right context, that in a committed, monogamous relationship, ideally marriage, but not necessarily, you have the possibility of enhancing and growing and strengthening that relationship in many different ways. Communication, respect. Ancient ways would have been providing for the needs physically of your spouse, home, clothing, food, all those things. But yes, absolutely sex, physical intimacy. We see that in the book Song of Songs, which is a part of the canon of the Bible. We see that in the idea of creation, that we are charged to not be alone, to find someone to cling to. That even the rabbi, watching and seeing the physical intimacy of his teacher and his wife, is Torah, is part of what we're supposed to incorporate into our lives. But also understanding respect for myself, respect for my partner, and understanding that in its time and in its place, it's a very important element. A very important element. These are those values that we continue to live. These are those values that we continue to express in all aspects of my life. Not just when I'm here in the synagogue, not just when I am doing one specific thing. I am Jewish because these elements are always foremost in my mind. And how I live my life, not just my religious life, there's no distinction. How I live my life is part of that identity, including in the bedroom. Including in the bedroom. Thank you very much, and I look forward to learning with you again soon.